No one noticed when the boys stopped eating. The laughter was loud, glasses clinked, conversations overlapped, and somewhere in the middle of it all, he sat there, quiet, invisible, forgotten. It wasn't the first time, and maybe that was the worst part. He had already learned that speaking wouldn't change anything. So he didn't. He just watched, listened, and waited until the phone on the table started vibrating. That night wasn't supposed to be different. It was just another family dinner, another table filled with noise, another moment where he would be present but not truly seen. People think silence means weakness, that a quiet child is just shy or distant. But sometimes silence is something else entirely. Sometimes it's observation. Sometimes it's patience. And sometimes it's the calm before something that no one at that table was prepared for. Because what happened after that phone call didn't just interrupt dinner. It changed how every single person in that room would remember that night for the rest of their lives. Ethan had learned, at a very young age, how to make himself smaller without moving an inch. He knew how to sit at the edge of a chair, so no one would ask him to slide over. He knew how to lower his eyes at the exact moment adults looked his way, because eye contact sometimes invited irritation, and irritation always found him faster than kindness did. At 10 years old, he already understood the emotional weather of a room better than most grown men. He knew when a joke was harmless and when it was sharpened like a knife. He knew when his mother's smile was real and when it was the strained kind she wore for survival. And on that Friday night, seated at the far end of a long restaurant table under soft amber lights, he knew before the drinks even arrived that he had not been brought there to be included. He had been brought there to complete the picture, to make the family seem whole in public. Even though everyone at that table had long ago decided he was the easiest part of that picture to ignore. The dinner was meant to celebrate his stepfather Richard's business deal, the kind of deal Richard liked to announce with dramatic pause, one hand wrapped around a glass, chin slightly raised, as though the world itself had been waiting for his signature. Richard was that kind of man, loud when praised, cold when challenged, and always deeply in love with a version of himself he believed other people envied. He had invited clients, his sister, and her husband, his mother Lorraine, and 2 family friends who laughed too quickly at everything he said. Ethan's mother, Claire, sat halfway down the table in a dress she had ironed twice, because Richard had once told her wrinkles made her look tired, and looking tired made him look unsuccessful. Ethan sat 3 seats away from her, near the corner, close enough to see the tightness in her jaw, but too far to reach for her hand, without drawing attention. No one had asked where he wanted to sit. His place had simply been set there, beside a floral arrangement and beneath a wall lamp that cast just enough shadow to make his face easy to miss. At first, he told himself it didn't matter. He had been in enough rooms like this to know the script. Adults would talk over one another, mention schools, vacations, money, and people Ethan had never met. Someone might ask him, without looking up, whether he liked school. If he answered too softly, they would say he needed confidence. If he answered too clearly, they would say he was being smart. So he had learned the safest option was silence trimmed to politeness. Yes, ma'am. No, sir. Thank you. That was the range allowed to him. He looked down at the folded napkin in his lap and listened to Richard retell the story of the deal 3 different ways in less than 15 minutes, each version making him sound more important than the last. Every laugh around the table felt practiced, the kind of laugh people use when they're investing in someone's ego because they think it will pay them back later. The waitress came by with bread, and the basket never stopped in front of Ethan. It passed over him like a forgotten detail in a painting. One of the clients asked Richard whether he had children, and Richard, without even turning his head, said, "Just a one," while gesturing vaguely toward his teenage daughter Madison, who sat near him scrolling through her phone, bored and entitled in the casual way of someone who had never once doubted her place in a room. Ethan felt the words land inside him with a dull familiarity. Not anger, not even surprise, just confirmation. Claire's eyes flickered up immediately, but only for a second. She looked at Ethan, then at Richard, then back at her plate. The look on her face carried an apology so old it had almost become part of her features. Ethan stared at the water glass in front of him and wondered, not for the first time, how many small betrayals a person could survive before they stopped feeling small at all. He had not always been quiet. Before his father died, he used to talk constantly about birds on telephone wires, about trucks, about the moon following the car, about things children say when they trust the world enough to narrate it out loud. His father had loved that about him. "Tell me everything," he used to say, as if a child's thoughts were treasure and not interruption. But after the accident, the apartment got quieter, his mother got thinner, and grief moved into their lives like an unpaid tenant who refused to leave. When Richard appeared a year later with pressed shirts, expensive cologne, and a confidence that made frightened people feel temporarily safe, Claire mistook control for stability. Ethan, too young to name what he sensed, only knew that rooms felt colder when Richard entered them. It started with corrections, then jokes at his expense, then exclusions disguised as discipline. By the time Claire realized she had married a man who measured love in usefulness, she was already financially dependent and emotionally worn down enough to confuse endurance with strategy. So Ethan learned to watch. That was his form of resistance. If he could not speak freely, he would at least see clearly. He noticed who interrupted whom, who changed their voice depending on who was listening, who smiled only with their teeth. He noticed that Richard always praised loyalty when he really meant obedience. He noticed that Lorraine, Richard's mother, called him sensitive whenever he looked hurt, as though pain itself were a flaw in character. He noticed that Madison had learned early that cruelty becomes socially acceptable when delivered with a shrug and a smirk. And he noticed, more painfully than anything else, that his mother was disappearing by inches. She still packed his lunch, still kissed his forehead at night, still whispered, "I'm sorry," after Richard humiliated him. But she had begun to live like someone constantly negotiating terms with a storm. Ethan loved her enough not to blame her, and that love made the loneliness heavier, not lighter. Dinner continued, course after course, conversation flowing around him like he was a chair instead of a child. When plates were set down, his came last. When a waiter asked who wanted sparkling water, 3 people answered over him before he had the chance. Madison made a joke about kids being dead weight at adult dinners, and 2 people laughed before realizing Ethan had heard. Richard did not correct her. He only cut into a steak and said, "He'll toughen up." Ethan nodded slightly, almost automatically, as if agreeing might dull the sting. He focused on the details instead. The polished silverware, the condensation on the glasses, the low jazz humming through hidden speakers, the reflection of chandeliers trembling on the dark window beside him. It was easier to anchor himself in objects than in people. Objects did not pretend to care. Objects did not fail you, and then ask to be admired anyway. What none of them knew was that Ethan had brought the phone in his pocket because of something his mother had whispered to him 3 nights earlier. She had done it while folding laundry, not looking directly at him, her voice low and careful. "If anyone ever asks for me and I can't answer," she had said, "you pick up, all right? No matter what." He had looked up from the towel he was folding and asked who might call. She hesitated too long before saying, "Just someone important." He wanted to ask more, but the sound of Richard's car in the driveway had ended the conversation like a slammed door. Since then, Ethan had carried his mother's old backup phone, the one she had secretly turned on again after Richard said there was no reason for extra devices in the house. It was tucked inside the inner pocket of his jacket that night, powered on, volume low, as if it carried not a call but a possibility. He didn't fully understand what the phone meant, only that it mattered. Over the past month, he had caught fragments of things that didn't fit together until they began to fit too well. His mother taking paperwork from a mailbox before Richard got home. His mother locking the bathroom door to make brief, tense phone calls. A manila folder hidden behind winter blankets in the hall closet. The word custody. The phrase document everything. Once, very late, after pretending to be asleep, Ethan heard Claire crying in the kitchen while speaking to someone named Daniel. She said, "I can't leave until I know he'll be safe." Ethan never forgot the way she said the word. He not as a general idea, but as a person worth risking everything for. It was the closest thing to certainty he had felt in months. Something was happening beneath the surface of their lives, something quiet and legal and dangerous, and for reasons he could not yet grasp, that forgotten phone had become part of it. Back at the table, Richard had launched into another speech, this one about discipline, standards, and how some people waste opportunities because they lack the right mindset. The clients nodded with the hungry agreement of men who had learned to flatter power before questioning it. Lorraine dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin and glanced at Ethan only when she needed a target for a sentence about gratitude. Children today don't understand how much is done for them, she said. They sit there expecting the world. Ethan looked at his untouched roll, at the main course already cooling, and almost smiled at the irony. Expecting the world had nothing to do with it. He would have settled for being acknowledged. Across the table, Claire's fingers tightened around her fork hard enough for her knuckles to pale. Ethan saw it. He saw everything. And because he saw everything, he noticed the exact moment her expression changed. It was subtle, a breath caught halfway, eyes flicking once toward his jacket, a tiny shake of the head, almost invisible. It lasted less than a second, but it electrified him. Before he could understand why, the phone inside his pocket began to vibrate. Not loudly, not enough to interrupt the table, but enough for him to feel the pulse against his side, like a second heartbeat. Once, twice, again. The room did not stop. No one looked at him. Richard kept talking. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed at something unfunny. Yet for Ethan, time seemed to narrow into a single point. His mother's warning, the hidden folder, the late-night tears, the careful instruction to answer no matter what. He slipped one hand beneath the table, fingers trembling only slightly, and pulled the phone into his lap. The screen lit up against the darkness under the tablecloth. The caller ID showed just one word, attorney. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. The word on the screen didn't feel like a name. It felt like a door, one that had been closed for a long time and was now quietly unlocking in his hands. The phone kept vibrating, steady and insistent, as if it understood the weight of being ignored. Above the table, nothing had changed. Richard was still talking, his voice rising and falling with rehearsed confidence, the others leaning in just enough to show interest, but not enough to truly listen. It was a performance, and Ethan had spent years studying it. But this was not part of the script. He glanced once toward his mother. Claire's eyes were fixed on her plate now, but her breathing had shifted, shallow, controlled, like someone tried to remain invisible while everything inside them was screaming to act. He remembered her voice in the laundry room. No matter what, the words came back not as suggestion, but as a command wrapped in fear. Ethan swallowed, adjusted the phone in his lap, and pressed accept. He didn't lift it to his ear right away. He hesitated just long enough to steady himself, then raised it slowly, keeping his elbow tucked close so the movement wouldn't draw attention. "Hello," he said, barely above a whisper. For a second, there was only static, a faint hum that made his chest tighten. Then a man's voice came through, calm but urgent, the kind of voice that didn't waste words because it knew exactly how much each one mattered. "Is this Ethan?" the voice asked. Ethan's throat felt dry, but he answered, "Yes." There was a pause, not of doubt, but of careful choice. "My name is Daniel Carter. I'm calling on behalf of your mother." The words were measured, deliberate, and something in them shifted the air around Ethan, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, okay? Is your mother with you right now?" Ethan's eyes flicked up instinctively. Claire hadn't moved, but he could see it now. The tension running through her shoulders, the way her fingers were curled too tightly around the edge of the table. She knew exactly who was calling. "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "Good," Daniel replied. "I need you to put me on speaker and place the phone on the table. Don't hide it. Don't wait. Just do it." Ethan's heart began to pound harder, not from fear alone, but from something sharper, clarity. This wasn't just a call. This was something meant to be heard. He lowered the phone slightly, his hand tightening around it as doubt tried, for one last second, to hold him back. Every instinct he had learned told him to stay quiet, to avoid drawing attention, to survive by not being seen. But this wasn't about surviving the moment. This was about changing it. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled the phone from beneath the table and set it down on the white cloth, right beside his untouched plate. The vibration against it would cut through the noise just enough to create a small ripple of attention. One of the clients glanced over first, then Madison, then Lorraine. The conversation didn't stop immediately, but it faltered like a record skipping. Richard noticed last. He turned his head with irritation already forming on his face, the kind reserved for interruptions he didn't authorize. "What is that?" he asked sharply, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the phone in front of Ethan. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for silence to begin replacing noise. Ethan didn't answer him. He didn't need to. The phone was already doing that for him. "Richard Hayes," Daniel's voice said clearly through the speaker, cutting through the air with calm precision. "This is Daniel Carter, attorney representing Claire Hayes. I apologize for the interruption, but this couldn't wait." Every face at the table froze, not in confusion, but in recognition of something serious entering the room without permission. Richard's expression changed instantly. Not softer, but tighter, controlled in a different way. "You don't call me during dinner," he said, his tone low and edge with authority. "Whatever this is can wait." "No, it can't," Daniel replied, not raising his voice, but removing any space for dismissal. "Because as of this moment, your authority in this situation is no longer relevant in the way you think it is." Claire's head lifted slowly. Her eyes moved from the table to the phone, then to Ethan. For a brief second, something passed between them. Fear, yes, but also something else. Relief, fragile and unfamiliar, like a light that had been off for too long suddenly flickering back on. Richard let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but—" "This isn't a game," Daniel interrupted, still calm, still precise. "Earlier today, a temporary protective order was filed and approved. It includes both Claire and her son. Documentation has already been submitted to the appropriate authorities, along with recorded evidence and financial records. You are being formally notified that any attempt to interfere, intimidate, or retaliate will result in immediate legal consequences." The words didn't explode. They didn't need to. They landed slowly, heavily, each one settling into the room like weight being added to a scale no one else had realized was tipping. The clients looked at Richard, not with admiration now, but with distance. Lorraine's posture stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line that could no longer shape judgment into confidence. Madison's phone slipped slightly in her hand as her attention, for the first time that night, locked fully onto Ethan. Richard's face hardened, but not in the way he intended. It wasn't control anymore. It was calculation, and beneath it, something less stable. "You think this changes anything?" he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. "You think you can just—" "It changes everything," Daniel said, and for the first time there was something unmistakable in his tone. "Finality. You've already been contacted through the proper channels. This call is a courtesy to ensure there are witnesses present. After tonight, there will be no more private conversations about this. Everything will proceed through legal representation." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of realization, of shifting power, of something breaking that had long pretended to be unbreakable. Ethan sat still, his hands resting lightly in his lap now, no longer hiding, no longer shrinking. He wasn't looking at Richard. He didn't need to. For the first time in that room, he wasn't measuring himself against the man who had spent years reducing him. He was simply present. Claire exhaled, a breath that seemed to carry years with it. Slowly, she placed her hand over Ethan's on the table, not under it, not hidden, visible. Deliberate, real. Richard noticed. Everyone noticed. And for once, There was nothing he could do to reposition the moment. No story he could tell that would turn it back into something he controlled. The boy who had been ignored all night had not raised his voice, had not argued, had not demanded anything. He had simply answered a call. And in doing so, he had changed the entire room. No one spoke immediately after the call ended. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from politeness. It was the kind that forms when reality rearranges itself too quickly for people to keep pretending. The soft music in the background suddenly felt out of place, almost inappropriate, as if the room had shifted into something more honest, while everything else remained staged. Ethan could feel it without needing to look up. The weight in the air had changed. Not because people suddenly cared about him, but because something larger than all of them had just entered the space, something none of them could dismiss with a laugh or a clever remark. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair, his fingers still wrapped around the knife he hadn't realized he was holding too tightly. His eyes moved across the table, scanning faces, measuring reactions, recalibrating. That was what he always did. He adjusted. Control for him wasn't about force alone. It was about perception. If he could reshape how people saw a situation, he could survive it. But this time, the room wasn't responding the way it used to. The clients who had been laughing minutes earlier were now quiet, their expressions guarded, their bodies subtly pulling back. They weren't aligning with him anymore. They were observing him. That was unnecessary, Richard said finally, his tone steadier now but thinner. A dramatic display for something that could have been handled privately. He glanced toward Claire as he spoke, but there was something different in the way he looked at her. Not authority, not ownership. Something closer to uncertainty. Claire didn't respond immediately. For years, she had learned to measure every word before speaking, to predict a reaction before expressing the thought. But that habit was built inside a system that had just cracked. Slowly, she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze fully, without flinching. It was handled privately, she said, her voice calm, but no longer fragile. You just chose not to listen. That landed harder than anything the attorney had said. Lorraine shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable, but still unwilling to abandon the role she had always played. Claire, this is not the place for this kind of conversation, she said, trying to reestablish some form of order. There are guests. There were always guests, Claire interrupted, gently but firmly. That never stopped anything before. Madison looked between them. Her expression caught somewhere between irritation and confusion, as if she had just realized she didn't fully understand the story she had been living inside. For the first time, she looked directly at Ethan. Not past him, not through him, but at him. And in that moment, the balance of the room shifted again. Quieter this time, but just as real. Richard exhaled through his nose, forcing a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. Let's not overreact, he said, his voice attempting to recover its usual rhythm. Legal language always sounds worse than it is. We'll sort it out. No need to make this a scene. But it was already a scene, just not the kind he could control. Ethan watched all of this without moving. He wasn't trying to win anything. That was the difference. Everyone else at the table was adjusting, defending, explaining, protecting something. He wasn't. He had done the one thing that mattered. And now he was simply witnessing what followed. There was a quiet strength in that, one that didn't need validation to exist. The waitress approached cautiously, as if unsure whether she was interrupting something personal or something irreversible. Is everything all right here? She asked softly, her eyes moving between the adults before briefly landing on Ethan. It was a simple question, one that would normally be answered automatically. This time it wasn't. Claire turned slightly toward her hand still resting over Ethan's. Yes, she said after a brief pause. Actually it is. And for the first time that night, that was true. Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because, for the first time, saying something wouldn't give him back control. The power in the room had shifted in a way that couldn't be reversed with words. It had been exposed. And once something is exposed clearly enough, it becomes very difficult to pretend it isn't real. Ethan looked down at the phone on the table one last time. The screen had gone dark again, just another object now, silent, ordinary. But he knew better. Some moments don't look important when they happen. They don't come with music or warning or visible change. They arrive quietly, almost invisibly, and then they divide everything into before and after. This had been one of them, and everyone at that table knew it. Richard didn't touch his food again. The plate sat in front of him, perfectly arranged, untouched, as if continuing to eat would somehow acknowledge that nothing had happened, and that was no longer an option. He reached for his glass instead, took a slow sip, and placed it down with deliberate control, buying himself time. Time to think, to reposition, to find the angle that would restore him. That had always been his strength, recovering the narrative before anyone else could define it for him. But this time, the narrative had already been spoken out loud, in front of witnesses, in a tone that didn't ask for agreement. "You're making a mistake," he said, finally, looking directly at Claire now, abandoning performance for something more personal. "You think this ends well? You think dragging lawyers into this gives you control?" His voice was calm, but the calm carried a quiet edge, the kind that had worked on her for years, the kind that used fear as a foundation. Claire didn't look away. That alone was new. "No," she replied just as calm. "It gives me protection. There's a difference." The word protection hung in the air longer than expected. It wasn't an accusation, but it didn't need to be. Everyone at the table understood what it implied, even if they didn't yet understand the full extent of it. One of the clients cleared his throat awkwardly, shifting in his seat, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. The illusion of a celebratory dinner had collapsed completely now, replaced by something far more uncomfortable. Truth without permission. Richard leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, as if trying to shrink the moment back into something private. "You're overreacting," he said. "Whatever you think you've built here, this case, this story, it won't hold." He paused, then added more pointedly, "You don't have anything that actually matters." Claire almost smiled, but it wasn't out of humor. It was recognition. For years, that sentence would have worked. It would have made her doubt, retreat, reconsider. But something had changed long before night. Something quiet, built piece by piece in moments Ethan had only partially understood. She reached for the glass of water in front of her, took a sip, then set it down with steady hands. "I didn't build it alone," she said. Richard's expression flickered. Just for a second. It was subtle, but Ethan saw it. He always saw it. The smallest break in certainty, the smallest delay in response. That was where truth lived. And for the first time, Richard didn't immediately know what to say next. Lorraine leaned in, her tone shifting from judgment to concern, but still wrapped in control. "Claire, think about what you're doing," she said. "These things escalate. They damage families. Once you start down this path, there's no easy way back." Claire turned to her slowly. "That's exactly why I waited this long," she answered. "That shut the conversation down more effectively than any argument could have." Madison pushed her chair back slightly, the sound of it scraping softly against the floor drawing attention again. "So, what happens now?" she asked, not with attitude this time, but with something closer to uncertainty. It was the first honest question asked all night. No one answered immediately, because the truth was, the answer wasn't something any of them could control anymore. Ethan sat quietly, his posture unchanged, but something inside him had settled. Not excitement, not relief exactly. Something steadier than that. For years, his world had been shaped by reactions, by adapting, by staying just small enough to avoid becoming a problem. But this moment wasn't built on reaction. It had been set in motion long before tonight. He had simply been the point where it surfaced. He glanced at his mother's hand still resting over his. It hadn't moved. It wasn't a gesture meant for show. It was grounding, real, and in that simple contact, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety yet, not fully, but direction. A sense that things were no longer drifting. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair sliding back with sharper sound this time. The room tensed slightly, instinctively reacting to the sudden movement. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his posture, and looked around the table, reclaiming, for a brief moment, the version of himself he preferred to present. "This dinner is over," he said, his tone firm, controlled again but thinner than before. "We'll continue this another time." No one argued, not because they agreed, but because they understood something had already ended. Claire didn't stand immediately. She waited, just long enough to make the choice visible. Then she rose, her hand gently guiding Ethan to his feet. There was no hesitation in her movement now, no scanning for approval, no calculation, just action as they stepped away from the table. Ethan didn't look back right away. He didn't need to. The room they were leaving behind had already lost its hold on him. The voices, the judgment, the careful exclusions, they no longer defined the space he occupied. But just before reaching the exit, he did glance over his shoulder, not at Richard, at the table, at the place where he had been invisible just an hour ago. And for the first time, he realized something simple, something that didn't need to be spoken out loud to be true. They hadn't ignored him because he was small. They had ignored him because they never imagined he could change anything. They were wrong. The night air outside felt different, not colder, not warmer, just clearer, as if the noise they had left behind had been pressing against the walls of that restaurant. And stepping out was like finally hearing your own thoughts again after hours of interruption. Claire didn't rush. That, more than anything, told Ethan how serious this was. She wasn't escaping. She was leaving with intention. They walked side by side toward the parking lot, the soft sound of their footsteps filling the quiet space between them. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already begun unfolding long before this night. Ethan held the phone in his hand now, no longer hiding it, turning it slightly as if trying to understand how something so small could carry so much weight. "Are you okay?" Claire asked finally, her voice softer now, but steadier than it had been in months. Ethan looked up at her. "Yeah," he said after a brief pause. And this time, it wasn't just politeness. "Are you?" She let out a small breath, something between a laugh and relief. "I think I am now." They reached the car, but Claire didn't unlock it immediately. Instead, she turned to face him fully, something she hadn't done in a long time. Not like this, not without distraction, not without fear pulling her attention somewhere else. "I'm sorry," she said. Ethan shook his head slightly, almost instinctively. "You don't have to say that." "I do," she replied. Not because of tonight, because of everything before it. There was no drama in her words, no attempt to make the moment bigger than it already was. Just truth, simple and direct. Ethan looked at her for a second longer, then nodded, not as forgiveness, not as closure, but as understanding. He had never needed perfect. He had only needed real. Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a set of keys Ethan had never seen before. Not their house keys. These were different, new. She held them for a moment, then pressed the unlock button on the car, the soft click echoing in the quiet lot. "We're not going back there tonight," she said. Ethan didn't ask where they were going. He already knew. As they got into the car, Claire placed her phone on the dashboard, hesitated for a second, then picked it up again and dialed. The call connected quickly. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm now, grounded. "We're on our way." There was a pause as she listened, nodding slightly. Yes, I understand. We'll be there in 20 minutes. She ended the call and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating a path that hadn't existed for them just days before. As the car pulled out of the parking lot, Ethan leaned back in his seat, watching the restaurant shrink in the rearview mirror. For years, that kind of place had defined the world he thought he lived in, a place where power was loud, where silence meant weakness, where being ignored was something you just learned to accept. But now, As the distance grew, something else became clear. That world had never been as permanent as it felt. It had only seemed that way because no one had challenged it. Ethan glanced at his mother, her hand steady on the wheel, her eyes focused forward, not scanning, not bracing, just moving. There was something different in her posture now. Not tension, direction. "Mom," he said quietly. She looked at him briefly. "Yeah." He hesitated for a second, then asked, "Was that call planned?" Claire didn't answer immediately. A small, knowing expression crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but close. "Not the timing," she said, "but everything else, yes." Ethan nodded slowly, looking back out the window. The city lights passed by in long streaks, each one marking distance from something that no longer held them in place. That's when he understood something deeper. He hadn't just answered a phone call. He had stepped into something that had been building long before he even knew it existed. And now there was no going back, only forward. The drive was quiet, but not heavy. It wasn't the silence of avoidance anymore. It was a silence of transition, the kind that comes when something has ended, and something else hasn't fully begun yet. Ethan watched the passing lights blur across the window, each one stretching and fading as the car moved forward. For years, forward had felt like something other people controlled. Tonight, it felt different. Not faster, not easier, just as. Claire kept both hands on the wheel, her posture steady, her breathing even. She wasn't checking the mirrors constantly anymore. She wasn't flinching at every passing car or slowing down unnecessarily at empty intersections. That alone told Ethan more than words could. She wasn't bracing anymore. She was moving with purpose. After a few minutes, she reached into the center console and handed him a small envelope. "This is for you," she said. Ethan took it carefully, turning it over in his hands. His name was written on the front in his mother's handwriting. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't hidden. It was intentional. "What is it?" he asked. "Something I should have given you earlier," she replied. He opened it slowly. Inside, there was a folded document and a short handwritten note. He read the note first. "If anything ever felt wrong, I needed you to know the truth existed somewhere. I didn't want you to grow up thinking silence was the only option. Mom." Ethan swallowed, then unfolded the document. It wasn't something he fully understood, not line by line, but he recognized enough. Names, dates, statements, signatures. It wasn't just a complaint. It was proof, organized, structured, built carefully over time. "You've been doing this for a while," he said quietly. Claire nodded. "I had to be sure." "Of what?" "That when we left, we wouldn't have come back." The words settled into him slowly but deeply, not just because of what they meant, but because of what they revealed. This wasn't a reaction to one bad night. This was an exit that had been designed long before it was executed. Every moment he had thought was random. The tension, the secrecy, the late-night calls. It had all been part of something deliberate. They drove a little further, before turning onto a quieter street. The houses here were simpler, older, but calmer. No oversized gates, no perfect landscaping trying too hard to impress. Just lights and windows, cars and driveways, signs of people actually living inside their spaces instead of performing them. Claire slowed down and pulled into a driveway in front of a modest two-story house. The porch light was already on. Ethan looked at it, then at her. "Here." She nodded. "For now." They stepped out of the car, and before they even reached the front door, it opened. A man stood there, mid-40s, composed, observant, not intimidating, not overly warm, grounded. "Claire," he said, stepping aside slightly. "Come in." Then he looked at Ethan. Not past him, not through him, at him. "You must be Ethan." There was no judgment in his tone, no assumption, just recognition. Ethan nodded. "I'm Daniel," the man said. "We spoke earlier." Ethan gave a small, almost automatic "yes, sir," then caught himself. Daniel noticed, but didn't comment. Instead, he gestured inside. "You're safe here," he said simply. "Safe." That word didn't land all at once. It didn't feel dramatic or overwhelming. It felt unfamiliar, like something Ethan had heard before, but never fully experienced in a way that held. They stepped inside. The house smelled like coffee and paper, quiet, lived in real. There were files on a table, neatly stacked, a laptop open, notes organized with intention. This wasn't chaos. This was structure, preparation, the opposite of everything Ethan had grown used to navigating. Claire set her bag down and exhaled, deeper this time. Not controlled, not measured, released. Daniel closed the door behind them, locking it with a soft click that echoed more than it should have. "Everything is in motion," he said, calm but firm. "From this point forward, nothing happens without documentation. Nothing happens without witnesses. You don't go back. You don't respond directly, and you don't engage outside of what we've already established. Understood?" Claire nodded immediately. Ethan listened closely, absorbing every word. Daniel looked at him again. "That includes you too." Ethan nodded. "Good," Daniel said, "because what you did tonight, placing that call on the table, that mattered, not just legally, structurally. It changed the position." Ethan didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to being told that something he did mattered in a room full of adults. Daniel noticed that too. "You don't have to understand everything yet," he added. "You just need to understand this. You're not invisible in this process." That stayed with him, more than anything else that had been said all night, because for the first time, someone wasn't just acknowledging that he existed. They were including him in what came next. The house settled into a quiet rhythm as the night moved forward, not tense, not heavy, just structured. Daniel didn't rush anything, didn't flood them with information all at once. He worked with precision, the kind that comes from experience, from having seen situations like this unfold in both directions. Papers were laid out, not dramatically, but methodically. Claire sat at the table, shoulders no longer tight, reading, signing, confirming details she already seemed to know by memory. Ethan sat nearby, not pushed away, not sent to another room, just present, watching. That alone was new. At some point, Daniel brought 2 glasses of water and placed one in front of Ethan without saying anything. It wasn't a gesture meant to be noticed. That's why Ethan noticed it. It was simple, direct, without judgment or expectation. He took a sip, eyes moving back to the documents, following the flow of something he was only beginning to understand. "Tomorrow morning," Daniel said, leaning slightly against the table, "the formal notice will be delivered. After that, any direct contact from Richard will be a violation." His tone wasn't dramatic. It was factual, controlled. There may be attempts to reach out anyway. Calls, messages, maybe even showing up. That's expected. But from now on, everything goes through me. Claire nodded again. "He won't take this lightly." "I know," Daniel replied. "That's why it's already prepared." Ethan listened carefully. There was something about the way Daniel spoke that removed uncertainty. Not because he promised everything would be easy, but because he didn't pretend it would be anything other than what it was. "Will we have to go back?" Ethan asked suddenly. Both adults looked at him. Claire answered first. "No," Daniel added. "Not unless it's on your terms." That distinction mattered. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, letting that settle. For years, places had been things you returned to because you had no choice, because someone else decided, because leaving wasn't an option you were allowed to consider fully. But now, that idea had shifted. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. The night moved forward in small, steady steps. Claire signed the last document and placed the pen down, her fingers lingering on the table for a second longer than necessary, as if confirming something internal had finally aligned. Daniel gathered the papers, organized them into a folder, and closed it with quiet finality. "That's it for tonight," he said. "You should both get some rest." Claire exhaled again, softer this time. Not relief alone, Release. Ethan stood slowly, unsure what came next, but not uneasy about it. That was the difference. Uncertainty was still there, but fear wasn't leading anymore. Daniel noticed his hesitation. "There's a room upstairs," he said. "Second door on the right. You can use it for as long as you need." Ethan nodded. "Thank you." It wasn't automatic this time. It was intentional. As he walked up the stairs, each step felt quieter than the last. Not because the house was silent, but because his mind was finally slowing down enough to catch up with everything that had happened. When he reached the room, he paused at the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. It was simple. A bed, a small desk, a lamp, a window partially open letting in the cool night air. No excess, no performance. Just a space. He placed the phone on the desk and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it for a few seconds. Earlier that night, it had been hidden in his jacket. Something secret. Something uncertain. Now it sat in the open. Just an object again, but one that had already done its part. Ethan lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling. For years, he had measured his world by what he had to endure, by how much he could tolerate without reacting, by how well he could stay quiet enough to avoid becoming a problem. Tonight had shifted that, not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because, for the first time, staying quiet had led somewhere, not into more silence, but into change. Downstairs, he could faintly hear Claire's voice, softer now, talking with Daniel, calm, grounded, real. No tension hiding between words. No fear shaping every sentence. Ethan closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, his mind didn't start preparing for tomorrow as something to survive. It felt like something that might actually unfold. Morning didn't arrive all at once. It came in quietly, through the thin line of light slipping past the edge of the curtain, spreading slowly across the room as if it didn't want to interrupt anything too abruptly. Ethan opened his eyes without the usual tension in his chest, without that immediate need to skim the day ahead for risks, for reactions, for the invisible rules he had spent years memorizing. For a few seconds, he just lay there, not moving, letting the unfamiliar feeling settle. Stillness without pressure. Then it came back to him. Not as a shock, not as panic. As clarity. He sat up slowly, glancing toward the desk where the phone rested exactly where he had left it. Silent now. Ordinary again. But nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. He stood, walked over, and picked it up, turning it once in his hand before placing it back down. He didn't need it right now. That, too, was new. Downstairs, he could hear low voices. Claire and Daniel. Not tense. Not urgent. Focused. He stepped into the hallway and walked down, each step measured but not cautious. When he reached the bottom, Claire looked up immediately. There was something different in her expression. Not just relief. Presence. "Good morning," she said. Ethan nodded. "Morning." Daniel glanced up from the table, where several documents were already spread out again, but fewer this time, more targeted. "Sleep okay?" "Yeah," Ethan answered. "Good," Daniel said, then gestured toward the table. "Come here for a second." Ethan walked over, stopping beside Claire. Daniel slid one of the papers slightly toward him. Not for him to read fully, but to show him something specific. "This," Daniel said, tapping lightly on a section, "is part of what was filed yesterday. It includes recorded patterns, financial inconsistencies, and statements that establish behavior over time. It's not built on one moment. It's built on consistency." Ethan looked at the page, not understanding every word, but understanding the structure. It wasn't random. It wasn't emotional. It was organized truth. "You don't need to know all of this right now," Daniel continued, "but you should understand something important. What happened last night wasn't the start. It was the point where everything became visible." Ethan nodded slowly. Claire reached over, placing her hand lightly on his shoulder this time, not holding on, not anchoring herself. "Just there. We're going to meet with someone later today," she said, "just to go over next steps. Nothing you need be worried about." "I'm not," Ethan replied. And again, it wasn't automatic. Daniel watched him for a second, then gave a small nod, almost to himself. Good. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Not loud, not aggressive, controlled. Claire's posture shifted slightly, not fear but awareness. Daniel stood immediately, already moving toward the door before the second knock came. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He simply moved like someone who already knew how to handle what might be on the other side. Ethan stayed where he was, but his attention sharpened instantly. Daniel opened the door just enough to see who was there. Two men stood outside, one in uniform, the other in plain clothes. "Mr. Carter?" the officer asked. "Yes," Daniel replied. "We're here to confirm delivery." Daniel nodded once. Understood. He stepped aside slightly, but not enough to allow entry. The exchange was brief, controlled, procedural. A document was handed over. A signature was confirmed. No raised voices. No confrontation. But the meaning was clear. It had reached him. Richard knew. Daniel closed the door, locking it again with the same quiet click as the night before. He turned back toward Claire and Ethan, holding the document for a second before placing it on the table. "It's official," he said. Claire exhaled slowly, but this time there was no tension attached to it, just confirmation. Ethan didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because for the first time, something had moved forward without needing to be hidden, softened, or delayed. Not loud, not dramatic, just real and irreversible. The house remained quiet after the officers left, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. This one carried weight. Confirmation that what had been set in motion was now moving beyond intention and into consequence. Ethan stood by the table, looking at the document Daniel had placed down, not reaching for it, just absorbing what it represented. It wasn't about the paper itself. It was about what it meant. The shift had been recognized outside that restaurant, outside their private reality. It existed now in the world beyond them. Claire moved slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if allowing herself to adjust to a pace she hadn't experienced in years. She wasn't rushing to anticipate a reaction, wasn't preparing for a response that hadn't come yet. That absence, the lack of immediate pressure, felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. It felt like space. Daniel closed his folder and leaned back slightly. "From this point forward, things may seem quiet on the surface," he said, "but that doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means everything is moving where it's supposed to." Claire nodded. "He won't stay quiet for long." "No," Daniel agreed. "But when he moves now, it won't be from a position of control." Ethan listened, not interrupting, but following every word. There was something different about how adults spoke here. No double meanings. No hidden edges. Just direct communication, built on structure instead of emotion disguised as authority. A few minutes passed before Claire's phone lit up on the table. No sound, just a screen. Ethan noticed it first. So did Claire. The name on the screen didn't need to be read out loud. Richard. The room didn't tense. That was the difference. Before, a call like that would have changed everything. Tone, posture, breathing. It would have dictated the next move before it was even answered. Now it just existed. Claire looked at it for a few seconds, her expression steady, then reached over and turned the phone face down without answering. Ethan watched that small movement more closely than anything else that had happened that morning. It was simple, quiet, but absolute. Daniel noticed too. "Good," he said. The phone buzzed again. Ignored. Then again. Still ignored. Each vibration felt weaker than the last, not because the phone changed, but because its power in that room had. After the fourth attempt, it stopped. No message followed immediately. Just silence. Claire sat down, her hands resting calmly in front of her. She didn't explain her choice. She didn't need to. Ethan looked at her, then at the phone, then back at her again. "Are you going to call him back?" he asked. Claire shook her head. "No. Ever." A small pause. Not like before. That answer carried more meaning than a longer explanation ever could. Daniel stood, gathering a few of the documents, organizing them with the same precision he had shown since they arrived. "We'll move step by step," he said. "No reactions, only decisions." Ethan leaned slightly against the table, letting that phrase settle in his mind. No reactions, only decisions. For most of his life, everything had been a reaction, adjusting, avoiding, enduring. This was something else entirely, something intentional. Claire stood again, moving toward the window, looking outside for a moment, not searching, just observing. The world hadn't changed out there. Cars passed, people walked, life continued. But inside that house, something fundamental had shifted. Ethan picked up the phone from the table, not Claire's, but the one from the night before. He held it for a moment, then placed it back down in the center of the table. Not hidden, not needed, just there. A reminder, not of what had happened, but of what had changed. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like something he had to brace for. It felt like something that would unfold, one decision at a time. The rest of the morning moved with a steady, deliberate pace, as if every action now had a place and a purpose. There were no sudden shifts, no raised voices, no unpredictable turns. Just structure. Claire made coffee, not out of habit, but because she could. Ethan sat at the table, not waiting for instructions, not trying to stay out of the way, just present, part of what was happening. That alone would have felt impossible a day earlier. Around midday, Daniel closed his laptop and looked at both of them. "We'll need to go over one more thing before this afternoon," he said. "Not complicated, but important." Claire nodded. "Okay." Ethan straightened slightly in his chair, instinctively attentive. Daniel leaned forward, resting his hands lightly on the table. "When someone loses control," he began, "they don't usually accept it quietly. They try to regain it. Not always directly. Sometimes through pressure. Sometimes through confusion. Sometimes through things that look harmless on the surface." Ethan listened closely. So if there are messages, calls, or even people reaching out on his behalf, Daniel continued, "You don't respond. Not emotionally. Not immediately. Everything goes through me." Claire nodded again, but this time slower. "Understood." Ethan asked, "Even if it sounds normal?" Daniel looked at him. "Especially if it sounds normal." That answer stayed with him, because normal had never actually meant safe. A little later, they left the house together, not rushed, not looking over their shoulders, just moving forward. The car ride was quieter than the night before, but not because there was tension. It was because there was less uncertainty to fill the space. They arrived at a small office building. Nothing impressive, nothing designed to intimidate, just clean, functional, real. Inside, everything felt similar to Daniel's house. Organized, intentional, focused. They sat in a room with a large table, and for the next hour, things were explained, not in overwhelming detail, but clearly enough to understand the direction, steps, process, what to expect, what not to react to. Ethan didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. He followed everything, building a quiet understanding of how things worked when they were built on structure instead of control. At one point, Claire signed another document, her hand steady, no hesitation. And then, just as things began to settle into a rhythm again, her phone buzzed. Not once, twice, then a third time. Claire didn't reach for it immediately this time. She glanced at Daniel first. He nodded slightly. "Check who it is. Don't respond." She picked up the phone, turned the screen toward herself. Her expression didn't change much, but Ethan noticed a shift. "What?" he asked. Claire hesitated for just a second, then turned the phone slightly so both of them could see. It wasn't Richard. It was someone else. Unknown number. And beneath it, a message. "You think this is over?" No name, no explanation. Just that. The room didn't panic, but it changed. Subtly, Daniel leaned forward, his expression focused now, sharper. "Don't reply," he said immediately. "Take a screenshot." Claire did exactly that. Ethan stared at the message for a second longer than necessary. Not because of fear, because of recognition. This wasn't over. It had just moved into a different phase. And for the first time, they were ready for it. Daniel didn't react with surprise. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. No sudden movement, no tension in his voice, just focus. The kind that sharpens instead of scatters. "Send that to me," Daniel said calmly. Claire forwarded the screenshot immediately. No hesitation, no second guessing. The difference between yesterday and today wasn't the situation. It was how they moved inside it. Daniel studied the message for a few seconds, then nodded once. "This is expected," he said. "When direct control is gone, indirect pressure starts. It's meant to provoke a reaction, confusion, fear, anything that makes you respond." Claire placed the phone back on the table. "It's not him." "No," Daniel agreed. "Or at least, not directly." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Then who?" Daniel looked at him, not dismissing the question. "Someone who thinks they're helping him. Or someone who benefits from keeping you uncertain." That made sense in a way that didn't need more explanation. "Does it matter who sent it?" Ethan asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. What matters is how you respond." Claire exhaled slowly, which is, we don't. Exactly. Silence settled again, but not the same kind as before. This one wasn't heavy. It was controlled, like a pause between moves in a game where both sides already understand what's happening. Daniel closed the folder in front of him. "From now on, anything like this gets documented. Time, number, content. No replies. No engagement. That's how pressure loses effect." Ethan nodded slightly. Pressure loses effect. That was new. Before, pressure shaped everything. It dictated tone, behavior, even silence. Now, it was something you could step around, instead of something you had to carry. Claire picked up the phone again, looked at the message one more time, then locked the screen and set it aside. Not ignored. Handled. They continued the meeting, but something had shifted again, not backwards, not into fear, but into awareness. The situation wasn't over. It had expanded, but it hadn't taken control of them. After they finished, Daniel stood and gathered the documents. "We'll keep moving forward," he said. "One step at a time. That's how this works." Claire nodded. "We're not going back." "No," Daniel replied. "You're not." Ethan stood as well, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something steadier. Not urgency, not tension, direction. As they walked out of the office, the daylight outside felt sharper, clearer. The world hadn't paused for them. It never does. But something inside their path had aligned in a way that didn't depend on what came next. Claire unlocked the car, but before getting in, she paused and looked at Ethan. "You okay?" she asked. He thought about it for a second. Not the automatic answer. Not the safe one. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I am." And this time, it wasn't just true for the moment. It felt like something that might last. Because whatever came next, they weren't reacting anymore. They were choosing. That afternoon didn't escalate the way most people would expect. There were no sudden confrontations, no dramatic appearances, no loud consequences chasing them down the street. Instead, everything moved in a quieter direction, structured, controlled, almost precise. And somehow, that made it feel more real. They stopped at a small grocery store on the way back. It wasn't planned. Claire just pulled into the parking lot, turned off the engine, and sat there for a second. "I don't think there's anything at Daniel's place for dinner," she said. Ethan nodded. "Okay." That was it. No tension. No checking the phone. No scanning the environment. They went inside like any other people on any other day. Fluorescent lights, aisles neatly arranged, the quiet hum of refrigeration units. It all felt strangely grounding, ordinary, in a way Ethan hadn't appreciated before. He walked beside his mother, picking up a few things without being told. Bread, eggs, something simple. At one point, Claire paused near an aisle and looked at him. "You don't have to stay quiet anymore," she said. Ethan frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in adjustment. "I know." "Do you?" she asked gently. He thought about it for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I just don't feel like talking right now." Claire smiled, small but real. "That's different." It was. Silence wasn't something he was using to protect himself anymore. It was just a choice. They paid, left, and drove back without interruption. No more messages. No more calls. Not yet. Back at the house, Daniel was on the phone when they entered, his tone low and controlled. Pacing slowly near the window, he raised a hand slightly to acknowledge them, then turned away to finish the call. "No, that's already been addressed. Any further contact goes through me," he said. A pause. "Yes, document it. Everything." He ended the call and looked at them. "He's trying to reach out through mutual contacts now," Daniel said. "Nothing direct. Just noise." Claire set the groceries down on the counter. "And—" Daniel shrugged slightly. "It doesn't change anything." Ethan leaned lightly against the doorway, listening. Noise. That's what it was now. Not authority. Not control. Just noise. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. Not out of secrecy, but precision. "The next phase is where most people slip," he said. "Not because they don't understand what to do, but because things get quiet, and quiet makes people second-guess themselves." Claire crossed her arms, not defensively, just grounding herself. "We won't." Daniel nodded. Then he looked at Ethan. "And you?" he asked. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm not going back." Daniel held that for a second, then gave a small, approving nod. "Good," he said. The rest of the evening unfolded without urgency. Claire cooked. Simple food. Nothing elaborate. Ethan helped without being asked. Not because he felt responsible for fixing anything, but because he was part of it now, present. At one point, the phone buzzed again on the counter. All three of them heard it. None of them moved. Claire continued stirring the pan. Daniel kept reading the document in his hands. Ethan glanced at the phone briefly, then looked away. It buzzed a second time, then stopped. No one asked who it was. No one needed to, because the power of that moment wasn't in the message. It was in the fact that nothing in the room changed because of it. Dinner was quiet, but not empty. Just calm. Real. Afterward, Ethan stepped outside onto the small porch. The night air cooler now. Steady. He sat on the steps, looking out at the street, watching nothing in particular. No rush of thoughts. No need to prepare for something coming. Just stillness. Inside, he could hear Claire and Daniel talking, voices low, consistent. For the first time in a long time, nothing felt like it was about to collapse. Not because everything was solved, but because, finally, everything was being handled. The night settled in without resistance. No sudden interruptions, no unexpected turns. Just a steady continuation of what had already begun. Inside the house, the lights were warm, the sounds minimal, and for the first time, nothing felt like it was being held together by effort alone. Ethan stayed on the porch longer than he expected. Not because he was avoiding going inside, but because there was nothing pulling him in or pushing him out. The air was cool, the street quiet, and the stillness didn't feel empty. It felt earned. After a while, the front door opened softly behind him. "You're going to get cold out here," Claire said. Ethan glanced back slightly. "I'm okay." She stepped out anyway, sitting beside him on the steps. Not too close, not distant either. Just there. For a few seconds, they didn't speak. Then Claire said, "I used to think waiting was the safest option." Ethan didn't respond right away. "Waiting for the right moment," she continued. "Waiting for things to calm down. Waiting for him to change. Waiting until I felt strong enough." Ethan looked down at his hands. Did it help? Claire shook her head slowly. No, it just made everything last longer. That made sense. Silence, waiting, adjusting. It had never actually changed anything. It had only delayed what eventually had to happen anyway. What changed? Ethan asked. Claire took a breath, thinking about it, not rushing the answer. I stopped asking whether I was ready, she said, and started asking whether it was right. Ethan nodded slightly. That difference mattered more than it sounded. They sat there a little longer before going back inside. The house was quiet now. Daniel had stepped into another room, finishing something on his laptop. The kitchen was clean. The phone sat untouched on the counter. Nothing was demanding attention. Ethan walked upstairs, slower this time, not because he was unsure, but because he didn't feel rushed. When he reached the room, he paused again just briefly, then went in and closed the door. He sat on the edge of the bed, then lay back, staring at the ceiling. No noise, no pressure, no anticipation of something going wrong. That absence felt strange, but not uncomfortable. Downstairs, Claire turned off the last light in the kitchen, then leaned against the counter for a second, letting the quiet settle around her, not as something fragile, but as something stable. Daniel stepped into the room, closing his laptop. You did well today, he said. Claire gave a small nod. We did. Daniel glanced toward the stairs briefly, then back at her. That matters more than you think. She understood that, because this wasn't just about leaving something behind. It was about building something different. And building takes consistency. Not one moment, not one decision, but many. Upstairs, Ethan closed his eyes, not forcing sleep, just allowing it. And for the first time in a long time, there was no part of him waiting for something to interrupt the night. No footsteps, no voices, no tension hidden in silence. Just rest, and a quiet certainty that tomorrow wouldn't start the same way it always had. Because something had already changed, and it wasn't going back. Morning came again, but this time it didn't feel like a continuation of something heavy. It felt like a beginning that didn't need to announce itself. Ethan woke up before the light fully filled the room. Eyes open, mind clear, not empty, but organized in a way he wasn't used to. No rush of thoughts, no scanning for problems before even getting out of bed. Just awareness. He sat up slowly, looking around the room as if confirming it was real. Same desk, same window, same quiet. Nothing had shifted overnight, and yet everything had. He stood, got dressed without hesitation, and went downstairs. Claire was already in the kitchen, standing by the stove, making something simple. Eggs, toast, the kind of breakfast that didn't try to impress anyone. Just enough. She looked up as he walked in. You're up early. So are you, he replied. She smiled slightly. Couldn't really sleep much. Why? Claire paused and answered honestly. Not because I was worried. Just adjusting. Ethan nodded. That made sense. Daniel walked in a few seconds later, holding a phone and a small folder. He didn't sit right away. He looked at both of them first. We're going to have a visit today, he said. Claire's expression didn't tighten, but it focused. From who? Daniel placed a folder on the table. Child services. The words didn't explode, but they landed. Ethan looked at him, not afraid, not defensive, just attentive. Claire took a slow breath. Okay. Daniel nodded once. This is standard. It doesn't mean anything is wrong. It means everything is being verified. Ethan asked, Do I have to say anything? Daniel looked at him directly. Only the truth. That answer didn't leave room for confusion. Claire placed the plate on the table and sat down when, in about an hour, silence followed, but not the kind that builds tension, the kind that prepares. Ethan ate slowly, not distracted, not rushing. He wasn't thinking about what to say. He wasn't rehearsing anything. That, too, was new. Before, every interaction had required preparation. What to say, how to say it, how to avoid consequences. Now it was different. Just the truth. After breakfast, Claire cleaned up, not because she had to, but because it was something normal to do. Daniel reviewed a few notes, not nervously, just confirming details. Ethan sat at the table, hands resting calmly, eyes steady. About 40 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Not aggressive, not hesitant. Official. Daniel stood immediately, walked to the door and opened it. A woman stood outside, early 40s. Professional, composed, observant. Not cold, not overly warm. Balanced. "Mr. Carter?" she asked. "Yes." "I'm Ms. Reynolds." Daniel stepped aside slightly. "Come in." She entered, her eyes scanning the room, not judging, just registering. Details, positions, tone. Then she looked at Ethan. Not quickly, not superficially. Fully. "You must be Ethan," she said. Ethan nodded. "Yes." "I'd like to talk with you for a few minutes," she said. He didn't look at Claire. He didn't look at Daniel. He just nodded again. "Okay." She gestured toward the table. "Is here all right?" Ethan sat. She sat across from him. Claire stayed nearby, but didn't interfere. Daniel remained standing, silent. Ms. Reynolds opened a small notebook, not rushing into questions. Then she asked calmly, "Can you tell me how things have been at home?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't know, because for the first time, he didn't need to filter it. He looked at her, then said, "Which home?" Ms. Reynolds didn't react immediately to the question. That, more than anything, told Ethan he had said something that mattered. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. "Tell me what you mean," she said calmly. Ethan didn't look away. "The house we lived in and how things actually were aren't the same thing." She nodded slightly, writing something down, not interrupting, not correcting. Just let him continue. "What was it like?" she asked. Ethan took a small breath, not to calm himself, but to organize his thoughts. "It depended," he said, "on him, on the day, on whether something bothered him." "By him, you mean Richard?" she clarified. "Yes." "And how did that affect you?" Ethan paused for a second, not because he didn't know, but because this was a part he had never been allowed to say out loud. "I learned to stay quiet," he said. "Not because I wanted to, because it made things easier." "For who?" she asked. Ethan held her gaze. "For everyone else." That answer shifted something in the room. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, not in shame, but in recognition. Ms. Reynolds nodded again, writing carefully. "Did you feel safe there?" Ethan didn't rush the answer. "No," he said. No hesitation. No adjustment. Just truth. "Why not?" she asked. "Because I didn't know what would happen if I did something wrong," he replied. "And sometimes I didn't even know what counted as wrong." Silence followed. Not empty. Focused. Ms. Reynolds looked up from her notes. "Did anyone ever hurt you physically?" Ethan shook his head. "No." She didn't stop there. "And emotionally?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Then he said, simply, "Yes." Claire closed her eyes briefly. Daniel remained still but attentive. Ms. Reynolds wrote something down, then looked back at Ethan again. "Can you give me an example?" Ethan thought for a moment, then said, "Being there and not existing at the same time." She stopped writing, just for a second, then continued. "That's important," she said quietly. Ethan didn't react. He had already said it. That was enough. After a few more questions, calm, direct, without pressure, Ms. Reynolds closed her notebook. "Thank you," she said. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do." Ethan nodded, not relieved, not tense, just steady. She stood, then turned to Claire. "I'll need to speak with you privately for a few minutes." Claire nodded. "Of course." They stepped into the next room, leaving Ethan and Daniel alone. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was settled. Daniel looked at Ethan, not immediately, then said, "You handled that well." Ethan shrugged slightly. "I just answered." Daniel nodded. "Exactly." That mattered more than anything else. A few minutes later, Claire returned with Ms. Reynolds. Their expressions weren't heavy. They were aligned. Ms. Reynolds picked up her bag. "We'll be in touch," she said. "But based on what I've seen so far, you're on the right path." Claire nodded. "Thank you." Ms. Reynolds looked at Ethan one last time. "You weren't invisible," she said. Then she left. The door closed. And just like that, another step was done. Not loud, not dramatic, but solid. Ethan stood there for a moment, letting it settle. Then he looked at Claire, and for the first time, there was nothing between them that needed to be hidden. The house didn't celebrate after she left. No relief that needed to be loud, no tension that needed to be released all at once. Just a quiet understanding that something important had been seen and recorded exactly as it was. That alone changed everything. Claire stood near the door for a few seconds after it closed, her hand still resting lightly on the handle, as if confirming that what had just happened wasn't going to be undone the moment she let go. Then she turned, slower than usual, and looked at Ethan. "You did more than you think," she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. "I just told the truth." Claire nodded. "That's what matters." Daniel stepped forward, already organizing the next steps in his mind, but not rushing them. "There's going to be a period now where things seem quiet again," he said. "That doesn't mean it's over. It means the process is doing what it's supposed to do." Claire crossed her arms lightly, grounding herself. "And him." Daniel's expression didn't change. "He's going to try something." Ethan looked at him. "Like what?" Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. "Not something direct. Not right away. He's already been warned. So the next move usually comes from a different angle. Something that looks reasonable on the surface." Claire understood immediately. Reputation. Daniel nodded. That word carried weight, because reputation was the one thing Richard had always protected more than anything else. The phone buzzed again on the counter. All three of them looked at it. Claire walked over this time, not rushed, not tense, and picked it up. She read the message, then handed the phone to Daniel. Ethan watched. Daniel read it once, then again, and for the first time since it started, his expression shifted. Not panic, but attention. "What is it?" Claire asked. Daniel turned the screen slightly so both of them could see. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't aggressive. It was clean, structured, deliberate. "We should resolve this like adults. No need to involve outsiders. Let's talk." Ethan read it carefully. It looked reasonable. That was the problem. Claire didn't say anything. She just looked at Daniel. Daniel exhaled slowly. "This is the move," he said. Claire's jaw tightened slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. "He wants control back." "Yes," Daniel replied, "but not the way he had it before. This is different. This is negotiation disguised as resolution." Ethan asked, "So what do we do?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "We don't engage." Claire nodded immediately, but Ethan kept looking at the message. "Why?" he asked. Daniel looked at him, then answered directly. "Because the moment you step into his frame again, even calmly, you're no longer operating from your position. You're reacting inside his." That made sense. Ethan nodded slowly. Claire took the phone back, stared at the message one last time, then locked the screen, placed it down, and walked away. No reply, no explanation, no reopening of anything that had already been closed. Silence followed, but this time it wasn't waiting. It was decision. Daniel picked up the folder again, flipping it open, already moving forward. From here on, everything stays documented, structured, and outside of his reach. Claire sat down, her posture steady. Ethan leaned lightly against the table, looking at both of them, then at the phone, then away. That message could have pulled everything back, into confusion, into doubt, into conversation. It didn't, because for the first time, they weren't trying to fix what had already been broken. They were building something that didn't depend on it. "Did you talk to him before calling me?" Claire asked, her voice steady but sharper now. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Yes," her sister admitted. But that's not the point. I'm calling because I'm worried about you. He said you left suddenly, that you're staying with some lawyer, that things are getting out of control. Out of control. Ethan didn't react outwardly, but he understood exactly what was happening. Richard wasn't defending himself. He was reframing the story. Daniel leaned slightly closer to the table, not interrupting, just listening with precision. Claire didn't rush her response. That's interesting, she said, because what actually happened is already documented. Legally. Another pause. Longer this time. Her sister's tone shifted, subtly. Claire, you don't need to escalate things like this. You know how these situations can get. Lawyers, reports have become something bigger than it needs to be. That was the second move. Minimize. Make the truth feel like an overreaction. Claire didn't take it. It's already bigger than you think, she replied calmly. Then why didn't you tell me? Her sister pushed. Why am I hearing this from him? That question landed differently. Not aggressive, but loaded. Claire's eyes lowered for a brief second. Ethan saw it. That was the closest thing to a weak point. Daniel noticed too. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Claire lifted her gaze again. Because every time I tried to say something before, she said, it was explained away. Silence. Real silence. On the other end, her sister didn't respond immediately, because that wasn't something you could redirect easily. Ethan stayed completely still, watching, learning. Then the tone changed again, more controlled, more calculated. Claire, listen to me, her sister said, softer now. I'm not against you, but you need to think about Ethan. This kind of conflict, it affects him. There was again, not direct attack, emotional leverage. Ethan, Claire's hand tightened slightly around the phone, but her voice didn't break. I am thinking about him, she said. Daniel gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Correct, the sister exhaled audibly. Then let's handle this like adults. Talk to Richard, face to face. No lawyers, just resolve it. Claire didn't answer immediately, and for a fraction of a second, the room shifted. This was the moment, the place where people go back. Not because they're weak, but because it feels easier. Ethan looked at his mother, not scared, not pleading, just present. And that was enough. Claire straightened slightly. No, she said, not loud, not emotional. Final. Her sister didn't expect that. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, Claire replied. I'm making sure it doesn't go back to what it was. Silence again. But this time, it was different because the manipulation didn't land. Her sister's voice came back, sharper now. You're being influenced. I don't recognize you like this. Claire's expression didn't change. That's because I'm not adjusting anymore, she said. That ended it. Not with a dramatic hang-up, not with an argument, just with a shift that couldn't be undone. I'll call you later, her sister said, colder now. Claire didn't respond. The line went dead. The phone lowered slowly. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Daniel finally said, that was the first wave. Ethan looked at him. How many more? Daniel's answer was simple. As many as it takes until he realizes it's not working. Claire placed the phone on the table. This time, she didn't look at it again, because now she understood something fully. This wasn't about defending herself anymore. It was about not stepping back into a system that only worked when she doubted herself. And for the first time, she didn't. The call didn't echo in the room after it ended. It settled. That was the difference. Nothing inside Claire rushed to fix it, soften it, or reinterpret it into something easier to accept. It had been clear, and clarity, once accepted, doesn't leave much room for confusion to grow again. Daniel didn't move right away. He let the moment hold its shape for a few seconds before speaking. That's how he expands reach, he said. Not by coming at you directly, but by building pressure around you. Claire nodded once. Family. Yes, Daniel replied, because it's harder to reject. Ethan leaned against the table, absorbing it. It wasn't just strategy, it was pattern. And once you saw the pattern, you couldn't unsee it. The phone stayed where it was. Still, neutral, not calling, not vibrating. But that didn't mean anything had stopped. Daniel reached for his folder again, flipping to a section Ethan hadn't seen before. Several pages, clipped together, marked with tabs. He pulled one sheet out and slid it across the table toward Claire. "What's this?" she asked. "Something we were waiting to confirm before using," Daniel said. Claire read the first lines. Then her expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Claire didn't answer right away. She kept reading, then slowly placed the paper down. "It's not just control," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "It never is." Ethan stepped closer, looking at the document. Numbers, transactions, dates, patterns. It wasn't random. It was structured. "What am I looking at?" he asked. Daniel answered directly. "Financial diversion." Ethan frowned slightly. Claire clarified, her voice lower now. "Money being moved without being visible." "From where?" Ethan asked. Daniel looked at him. "From accounts that are supposed to be shared." That landed, because that meant this wasn't just about behavior. It was about control through dependency. Claire sat back slowly, processing it. "So everything I thought was limited wasn't." Daniel nodded. "It was controlled." Ethan looked between them. This was bigger than he thought. And that realization changed something again, not in fear, but in understanding. Claire leaned forward again, her voice steadier now. "Can this be used?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes." "How much does it change things?" Daniel gave a small, controlled exhale. "It changes the entire structure." Silence followed. But this time, it wasn't tension. It was alignment. Because now, everything made sense. The restrictions, the pressure, the control. It wasn't random. It was designed. Ethan stepped back slightly, letting it settle in his mind, then asked something simple. "So, he didn't just want control." Daniel finished it. He needed it. That difference mattered. Because someone who wants control can let it go. Someone who needs it won't. Claire closed her eyes briefly, not overwhelmed, but recalibrating everything she thought she understood. Then she opened them again. Clear, focused. "No more conversations," she said. Daniel nodded. "There shouldn't be." Ethan looked at her, then at the document, then back at her again. This wasn't just a situation anymore. It was a system. And now they understood it. And when you understand something fully, you stop reacting to it. You start dismantling it. And that's when things really change. Daniel didn't push the moment. He let the realization settle where it needed to, inside clarity, not emotion. That was the difference between reacting and moving forward. Claire stayed seated for a few seconds longer, her eyes still on the document, but not reading anymore. She wasn't gathering new information. She was reorganizing everything she already knew. Ethan watched her carefully. This wasn't the same version of his mother. Before, when something serious surfaced, it would bring hesitation, second-guessing, a need to talk it through multiple times before acting. Now there was none of that, just stillness, followed by direction. She stood, not abruptly, decisively. "What's the next step?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He walked over, took the document back, and placed it into a folder with the rest, aligning it carefully, as if placing it exactly where it belonged in a larger structure. "We don't rush," he said. "We use this at the right moment." Claire nodded. Ethan frowned slightly. "Why wait?" Daniel looked at him. "Because timing determines impact." That made sense. A truth used too early can be ignored. Used correctly, it changes everything. Before Ethan could ask anything else, the phone rang again. But this time, it wasn't Claire's. It was Daniel's. That changed the tone instantly. Daniel looked at the screen, didn't speak, then answered, "Yes." His voice didn't change. but his posture did. More focused, more still. Claire and Ethan watched in silence. Daniel listened for several seconds, then said, "When?" Pause. "I understand." Another pause. Then, "Send it to me." He ended the call, placed the phone down slowly, and for the first time, there was no need to interpret anything. "What happened?" Claire asked. Daniel looked at her, then at Ethan, then back at her. He moved. Daniel said. Claire didn't react immediately. "How?" she asked. Daniel exhaled once. He filed. That word landed heavier than anything before. Not a message, not a manipulation, an action. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Filed what?" Daniel answered directly. "A claim." Claire's jaw tightened, not in fear, but in understanding. "Against me?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Silence filled the room, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one had weight, direction, finality. Ethan asked quietly, "What kind of claim?" Daniel held his gaze. "Custody." That changed everything. Not emotionally, structurally, because now this wasn't just defense anymore. It was a confrontation. Claire didn't sit back down, didn't hesitate, didn't ask what if. She stepped closer to the table. "What does he think he has?" she asked. Daniel didn't soften the answer. Enough to try. Ethan felt that. Not fear, but reality. Because trying was the part that created risk. Claire looked at the folder, then at Daniel, then said something that shifted the entire direction again. "Then we don't wait anymore." Daniel studied her for a second, then nodded. "Now we move." That was a turning point. Not the call, not the message, not the document, the decision. Because from that moment forward, they weren't just responding to what Richard was doing. They were stepping ahead of it. And that's where control changes hands. Completely. Daniel didn't waste time after that. The shift from preparation to execution was immediate, but not chaotic. Everything that had been built quietly until now began to move with precision. He opened the folder again, pulled out 2 sections, and placed them on the table in front of Claire. No explanation yet, just placement. "Read this," he said. Claire did. Her eyes moved faster this time, not scanning, not searching, recognizing. Ethan watched closely. He could see it again, that subtle shift in her expression. Not fear, not doubt, confirmation. "This is enough," she said. Daniel nodded. "More than enough, if we use it correctly." Ethan leaned slightly forward. "Use it how?" Daniel looked at him, then answered without softening anything. "We don't just defend. We reframe the entire case." That was different, because defense reacts. Reframing, controls. Claire placed the paper down. "Then we do it now." Daniel gave a small, controlled nod. "We file a counter." That word carried weight. Not emotional. Strategic. "What does that change?" Ethan asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "It forces everything into the open." That was the real move. Because everything Richard had built depended on control behind the scenes. Quiet pressure. Selective narratives. Hidden structure. If everything became visible, he lost that advantage. Claire understood immediately. And the financial records? Daniel's eyes locked on hers. That's the center. Ethan felt that. Because this wasn't just about what Richard said anymore. It was about what he did. And what he did could be proven. Daniel gathered the documents, already organizing them into a new structure. "We file today. We don't wait for his position to stabilize. We disrupt it before it forms." Claire nodded once. "Good." There was no hesitation left. No second guessing. Just movement. And that's when the phone buzzed again. Claire's. She didn't reach for it. Daniel didn't either. Ethan glanced at it briefly, then looked away. It buzzed again, then stopped. And that moment said more than anything else. Because before, that would have controlled everything. Now, it didn't even interrupt the next step. Daniel closed the folder. "We leave in 10 minutes," he said. Claire grabbed her bag without asking anything else. Ethan stood. No instructions needed. They moved together, not reacting, not waiting, moving. The drive felt different this time. Not quiet because of uncertainty. Quiet because of focus. Claire kept her eyes on the road, steady. Daniel reviewed something on his phone. Ethan watched the road ahead, not thinking about what could go wrong, thinking about what was already in motion, because something had shifted again. This wasn't about escaping anymore. This was about taking position. They arrived at the building, same as before, but everything felt sharper, faster. Inside, things moved quickly. Documents printed, signed, filed. No wasted words. No hesitation. At one point, Daniel handed Claire a final page. "This is the one that changes everything," he said. Claire read it, then signed. No pause. That was it. Daniel took the document, looked at it once, then said, "It's done." And just like that, the direction changed. Completely. Outside, as they stepped back into the daylight, Ethan felt something settle inside him. Not excitement, not relief. Something more stable. Because now, it wasn't just about what Richard might do. It was about what had already been done. And that difference is what decides the outcome. Claire looked at Ethan as they walked to the car. Not checking, not worried. Seeing him. "You okay?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Yeah." Then added, "He's not in control anymore." Claire held that for a second, then gave a small, real nod. "No," she said. "He's not." And for the first time, that wasn't hope. It was fact. The next move didn't come immediately. And that was the point. After the filing, everything went quiet again, but this time it wasn't uncertainty. It was pressure building on the other side. Ethan could feel it without needing to see it. When control shifts, the one who loses it doesn't always react fast. Sometimes they pause, try and understand what just happened, try and find a way back in. Richard was calculating. Daniel expected that. Now he has to respond inside the system. Daniel said later that afternoon, standing near the window, phone in hand but not looking at it. He can't control it from the outside anymore. Claire sat at the table, calmer than she had been in years, but more focused than ever. So what does he do now? Daniel answered simply. He tries to rebuild his position. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms relaxed, listening. "How?" he asked. Daniel turned slightly. "By trying to make you look unstable." That landed, not emotionally, strategically. Claire didn't react with anger. She nodded. "That's consistent," she said, because that had always been a pattern. If he couldn't control directly, he would redefine. And just as Daniel finished saying that, the phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't a message. It was a notification. Daniel's. He looked at the screen, opened it, and for the first time since everything began, he let out a small exhale through his nose. Not frustration. Recognition. "It started," he said. Claire stood. "What?" Daniel turned the screen slightly. "She's been contacted." Claire frowned. "Who?" Daniel answered. "Your employer." Silence, but not confusion. Understanding. Ethan processed it immediately. Reputation. Not direct attack. Pressure. Claire didn't sit back down. Didn't freeze. "What did he say?" she asked. Daniel scrolled briefly, then answered. "He raised concerns about your emotional stability and your ability to maintain a safe environment." The wording was precise, carefully chosen, not aggressive, but damaging, it believed. Ethan felt that shift, not fear, but escalation. Claire stood completely still for a second, then asked, "Do they believe it?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet." That word mattered. Yet. Claire walked to the window, looked outside, then said something that shifted the direction again. "Then we don't defend that." Daniel looked at her. "Explain." Claire turned back. "We don't respond to accusations," she said. "We present structure." Daniel held her gaze for a second, then nodded. "That's exactly right. Because defense reacts. Structure replaces." Ethan watched both of them. Something was happening here that he had never seen before. They weren't arguing against the problem. They were stepping above it. Daniel picked up his phone again. "I'll handle the contact," he said. "We don't let his version define the starting point." Claire nodded. Ethan asked, "And if he keeps doing it?" Daniel answered without hesitation. Then he built the case against himself. That made sense. Because once something is documented, repeated behavior becomes proof. The rest of the day didn't slow down. It sharpened. Daniel made calls. Clear, controlled, no emotion, only structure. Claire reviewed documents again, not because she doubted anything, but because now she understood exactly how everything connected. Ethan stayed close, not out of need, but because he was part of it now, fully. Later that evening, the phone buzzed again. Claire's. She looked at it, didn't pick it up, but this time she showed it to both of them. It wasn't Richard. It wasn't her sister. It was her employer. A message. Short, direct. "We received some concerns. Can you come in tomorrow to talk?" Ethan looked at Claire. This was it. The real pressure point. Work, stability, reputation. Everything Richard needed to destabilize. Without touching them directly. Claire read it once. Then again. Then locked the phone. Placed it down. And said, "Good." Ethan frowned slightly. "Good." Claire looked at him. "Yes." Daniel smiled slightly. Because he understood. Ethan asked, "Why?" Claire answered clearly. "Because now it's happening in the open." That was a shift. No more hidden pressure. No more quiet control. Everything was visible. And once something is visible, it can be handled. Daniel nodded. "We go tomorrow," he said. Claire agreed. Ethan looked between them and realized something important. This wasn't the moment where things could fall apart. This was the moment where everything would be tested. And for the first time, they were ready for that. Not emotionally, structurally. That night felt different again. Not calm, not tense, focused, because tomorrow wasn't about reacting. It was about proving, and proving changes everything. Morning came sharper than the others, not heavier, just more defined. Ethan woke up before the alarm again, but this time his mind didn't drift, it aligned. Today wasn't uncertain. It had a direction. He got dressed without hesitation and went downstairs, already knowing this wasn't a day to observe quietly. This was a day where things would be tested in the open. Claire was already ready, not rushing, not anxious, prepared. That was the word. Daniel stood near the table, reviewing a final set of documents, flipping pages with the same control rhythm as always. But there was something slightly different now. This wasn't preparation anymore. This was positioning. "We leave in 15, he said, without looking up. Claire nodded. Ethan sat briefly, but didn't stay long. There was no need for routine today. Everything felt intentional. The office building was different from the legal one. Cleaner, corporate, structured in a different way. This wasn't about law. This was about perception. They walked in together. Reception. Neutral smiles. Polite greetings. No tension on the surface. But Ethan could feel it underneath, because this was where narratives mattered. They were called in quickly. A small meeting room. Glass walls. 2 people already seated. HR and Claire's direct supervisor. Both professional. Both controlled. Both observing. "Thank you for coming," the HR representative said. Claire nodded. "Of course." They sat. Daniel remained beside her. Ethan slightly behind, but present, not hidden. That was intentional. The HR representative began. "We received some concerns," she said carefully. "Nothing formal yet, but enough that we felt it was important to address directly." Claire didn't respond immediately. She didn't offend. She didn't explain. She waited. That alone shifted the room, because most people would start talking, filling space, trying to fix perception. She didn't. So the HR representative continued. There were mentions of emotional instability, sudden changes in behavior, and concerns about your home environment. Ethan watched closely. This was it, the framing. Claire leaned forward slightly, then said, "I understand." That wasn't agreement. It was control. Daniel placed a single document on the table, didn't push it forward, just placed it. "This should clarify everything," he said. No explanation, no build-up, just structure. The HR representative hesitated for a second, then took it. "Read." Her expression changed. Subtly, then more. She passed it to the supervisor. Silence. Real silence. Not uncomfortable. Processing. "What is this?" the supervisor asked. Daniel answered directly. "File documentation, including protective order, supporting records and financial evidence tied to pending case. No emotion, no exaggeration, just fact." That changed the entire room, because now this wasn't a concern. It was a situation. Structured, verified, real. The HR representative straightened slightly. "This wasn't mentioned to us." Claire responded calmly. "It wouldn't be." That landed, because it explained everything without needing to explain more. The supervisor looked at Claire again, different now, not evaluating, understanding. "Is there anything affecting your ability to perform your role?" he asked. Claire answered without hesitation. No. And for the first time, that answer wasn't something she had to convince herself of. It was true. The HR representative nodded slowly. "Thank you for bringing this forward." Daniel added, "We're ensuring everything remains documented and transparent." Again, structure, not defense. A few more questions followed. Clear, direct, no tension, because the frame had changed. They weren't responding to accusations anymore. They had replaced them. After the meeting ended, they stepped outside. The air felt different, not lighter, clearer, because something had been tested and held. Ethan looked at Claire. She wasn't relieved. She was steady. That was stronger. "You handled that," he said. Claire looked at him, then said something simple. "No." Pause. "We handled it." Daniel gave a small nod, because that was the truth. As they walked to the car, Ethan realized something deeper. Richard had made his move, a smart one, calculated, targeted, and it failed, not because they fought it, but because they didn't play inside it. And that was the real turning point, because from here, there weren't many moves left, and the ones that remained would expose everything. Completely. From that moment on, everything moved with precision. Daniel didn't react emotionally. He structured. He opened a new file, pulled in the financial records, cross-referenced the numbers from the proposal, and aligned them with what had already been filed. Every inconsistency wasn't just noted, it was positioned. Claire watched. Ethan stood beside her. Neither of them spoke, because they understood. This wasn't just a mistake. This was exposure. "He rushed," Daniel said quietly. Claire nodded. He thought he still had control. Daniel didn't look up. He thought he could redefine the outcome before the structure caught up to him. Ethan asked, "And now?" Daniel stopped typing, looked at both of them. Now he just gave us proof. The response was filed that same afternoon. Not aggressive, not emotional, precise. Every number, every mismatch, every inconsistency laid out clearly. No accusations, just facts that couldn't coexist with his version of the story. 2 days later, the hearing was scheduled. The room was different from everything before. No glass walls, no soft tones, no polite framing. This was where everything became official. Claire sat upright, Daniel beside her, Ethan slightly behind, but again not hidden, never hidden. Richard was already there. For the first time, Ethan really looked at him, not as a presence, not as something to adjust to, but as a man. And something was different, not weaker, but exposed, subtle, but visible. Richard didn't look at Ethan. He looked at Claire, then at Daniel, then away, calculating, still trying. The hearing began, formal, structured, controlled. Words mattered here. Not tone, not presence, not perception. Structure. Richard's attorney spoke first. Confident, measured, attempting to establish instability. To frame Claire's actions as reactive, emotional, disproportionate. It was well constructed, but it depended on one thing, that their version held. Daniel didn't interrupt, didn't react. He waited until it was his turn. Then he stood. No performance, no raised voice, just alignment. We won't address assumptions, he said. Pause. We'll address records. That shifted everything. Immediately, he placed the documents forward, one by one, structured, clear, unavoidable. These figures, he continued, were submitted in an attempt to reach a resolution. He paused slightly, then added, they do not match any verifiable record tied to the shared accounts. Silence. Richard's attorney shifted. Subtle, but real. Daniel continued, not partially. Pause, not interpretively. Another pause. Completely. That was the moment, because now it wasn't about narrative anymore. It was about contradiction, and contradiction destroys credibility. The judge looked down at the documents, reviewed, then looked up, not at Claire, not at Daniel, at Richard, and asked one question. Can you explain this? That was it. Not an accusation, not an attack. A question. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. This is... He stopped because there was no version of that sentence that could hold. Ethan watched, not with satisfaction, not with anger, with clarity, because for years, this man controlled everything through certainty, through confidence, through narrative, and now he had none. The silence stretched, long enough to become real. Daniel didn't move, didn't add, didn't push. He didn't need to, because the structure was already doing the work. Finally, Richard's attorney stepped in, attempted to redirect, to soften, to reframe, but it didn't land, because once something is exposed clearly, it doesn't go back. The judge made a note, closed the file, then said, this will be reviewed further. Pause. Then, but the discrepancies are significant. That was it. Not dramatic, not loud, final, because from that moment, the direction was set. Outside the courtroom, no one rushed, no one celebrated. Claire stood still for a second, then exhaled, not relief, release. Daniel looked at her. It's over, he said. Not completely, but enough. Ethan stood there, quiet, but not the same quiet as before. Claire turned to him. You okay? He nodded, then said something simple, something that didn't need explanation. He couldn't control it. Claire held that, then nodded. No, she said. He couldn't. They walked out, not escaping, not recovering, moving. And Ethan realized something that stayed with him, something that didn't need to be said out loud to be true. For years, he thought silence meant weakness, that being quiet meant being overlooked, that not reacting meant losing. But that night, at that table, he stayed silent. And everything changed, not because he spoke louder, but because he chose the moment. And that was the difference between being ignored and being underestimated. And once someone underestimates you, they don't see the moment coming until it's already happened. The days after the hearing didn't feel dramatic. There was no sudden collapse, no loud consequence chasing Richard down in a visible way. Instead, everything unfolded quietly, decisions being processed, documents moving, Structure's finalizing what had already been exposed. But inside that quiet, everything had already changed. Ethan noticed at first in the smallest details. The way his mother moved through the day without hesitation. The way her voice no longer adjusted depending on who was listening. The way silence in the house didn't feel like something waiting to break, but something that could exist without pressure. That was new, and that was real. Richard didn't disappear. People like him don't. But he stopped being a presence that shaped everything. He became something else. Contained, limited, defined. And once someone becomes defined inside a structure they can't control, they stop being a force. One evening, a few days later, Ethan sat at the same table in Daniel's house. Simple, quiet, normal. There was food, there was conversation, but no performance. No tension hidden inside politeness. No need to measure every word before speaking. Claire looked at him at one point and said, "You don't have to watch everything anymore." Ethan thought about that, because for years, watching had been survival, reading the room, predicting reactions, staying one step ahead of something unpredictable. Now, there was nothing to predict. "I know," he said, and this time, it wasn't something he was learning. It was something he understood. Later that night, he stepped outside again. Same porch, same quiet street, but not the same person. He sat on the steps, looking out, not waiting for something to happen, just being there. And that's when the realization came. Not loud, not dramatic, simple. Nothing had changed in one moment. Not really. It had been building, piece by piece. Decision by decision, truth by truth, and the moment that seemed small, the moment no one noticed, the moment he answered the phone, that was the point where everything became visible, not because it was powerful, but because it was precise. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He didn't try to prove anything. He just didn't ignore what mattered, and that was enough. Inside, Claire turned off the last light. The house settled into quiet. Not fragile, not temporary, stable. Ethan stood up from the steps and walked back inside. No hesitation, no pause at the door, because for the first time, he wasn't stepping into something he had to survive. He was stepping into something he belonged to, and that changes everything. If you've ever felt invisible, if you ever stayed silent just to keep the peace, remember this. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's timing, and when the moment comes, it only takes one move to change everything.